So let's use the golf swing as a representation of our expansion to compression to expansion model. Good morning. Happy Friday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. I am still in the afterglow of yesterday's Coffee and Coaches conference call. It was different than any call that we've had before. We went a couple hours. It felt like 2 minutes. Really, really good questions. Tough questions, actually. Kind of philosophical, but got a lot of great feedback on that. So I hope you can join us next Thursday, 6 a.m. for the Coffee and Coaches conference call. Now, let's dig into today's Q&A. It's going to allow us to examine some of our expansion to compression to expansion concepts, and we're going to do it under the guise of a golf swing. This is a two-parter question, and like I said, we'll review some external rotation and internal rotation concepts. We'll look at the swing, and then we're going to look at some of the negative secondary consequences of when we don't have this representation of expansion to compression, because I think a lot of things show up clinically when people either lose their capabilities or they train away some capabilities. So let's go to Johnny's question. Johnny says, hey Bill, hey Johnny, is hip abduction, and he puts it in quotes, Johnny's really smart, at 90 degrees of traditional hip flexion, once again, I like the traditional, hip flexion considered ER/IR. Okay, so is this movement away from midline, internal rotation or external rotation? So let's grab the pelvis and let's take a look at this thing. So when we look at where we are at 90 degrees, so theoretically, if everything's all fine and wonderful, we're going to be starting from this position of internal rotation. But we have to consider when we have movement away from midline, when we want to decide what's happening here at the hip, we have to consider the relationship between the femur, the innominate bone, the sacrum, and the lumbar spine, because all of them are going to contribute to the position and the movement. And so under whatever circumstances this may be occurring, I can have a different outcome. So if I start from this position, which we would say is traditional hip flexion at 90 degrees, and I'm going to move away, if I have an innominate that is biased towards inhalation, as this moves away from midline, I'm going to see more of an external rotation, but visually, obviously, it's going to move in this straight line, if you will. But the reality is that I'm producing a rotation here at the hip joint. If I am biased towards an inhalation strategy at the pelvis, then what I'm going to see is I'm going to see it turn this way as it moves away from midline, and now I've produced an internal rotation. So Johnny, I think that when you're trying to determine which one it is, you're going to have to look at the context in which it's being applied. And so if I was in a split squat and I see someone's knee deviate outward, under most circumstances, you're going to have somebody that's going to be biased towards inhalation. That's going to be an ER kind of a situation. Sometimes as you see people move through that 90 degrees in a deep squat, for them to actually achieve the deep squat, what they're doing is they're moving that hip into internal rotation, even as the knees are deviating away from midline. So again, I think you need to pay attention to those relationships. So now let's go to your second part of your question. And Johnny asks, what does the internal rotation representation of the pelvis look like, and how might you go about acquiring this? And he asks because he wants to relate it to the golf swing, because we've talked about this before, where I mentioned that the two ends of the golf swing are external rotation, which I think is confusing to a lot of people, because I think that the representation has always been that it is an IR position. One of the things that we always need to understand is that we have superimposition of internal and external rotations. It's not an either or. So dead guy anatomy has given us this imaginary 0 point that's straight up, and so anything out here is ER, anything in here is IR. And the reality is that we have this expansive field of ER, and we superimpose internal rotation on top of that. And so if we take away the external rotation field, so if I squeeze this external rotation field inward, then that creates a limitation on my internal rotation capabilities. And this is where we're going to see compensatory strategies evolve. And we'll get to that kind of at the end of this talk, where we talk about some of the substitutions that we may see for this loss of range of motion. But we want to go back and look at how our external rotation represents our expansive strategy, and we move towards internal rotation. This is where we have that maximal compressive capability, and this is where our highest force is produced at this point of maximal compression. Our expansion is where we demonstrate movement and velocity. So let's not confuse the two, because we move into these positions of internal rotation, and that's where time stops. That's where we squeeze, that's where we compress, and that's where we produce our highest forces. Now, what does this ER look like in the pelvis? Because Johnny, I want to talk about the ER position so we can move you towards the IR position so you get that representation as well. Now, what I would refer you to, we talked about early and late propulsive strategies in a recent video. I think it was back in December. I'll post the little thingy here that you can click on YouTube. But so we're going to look at this early propulsive strategy. So I'm going to talk about the right hip. So this, if I was a right-handed golfer, this would be my backside hip. So my backswing is going to go to the right. And so what we're going to see, Johnny, is we're going to see this sacrum moving back on the ilium, because I got to turn the sacrum towards the right side. I got to turn the lumbar spine towards the right side. Lumbar spine can't turn in that direction if I'm internally rotated on this side. So I have to have this representation of external rotation. Now, does that mean that there's no internal rotation? Absolutely not, because I have to create this first, and then I can actually turn into this hip. And so again, I'm starting to superimpose internal rotation on top of my field of external rotation that is created by my early propulsive representation in the pelvis. So let me reach over here. Give me 1 second. I got to grab my foot. So now, if we talk about foot position, and you'll see this on just about every golfer, but when I see my foot position, I got this early propulsive representation of the foot that's going to look like that as they move into their backswing. But I want to make sure that I hang on to this first metatarsal head, because if I pick that up off the ground, I am in a compensatory strategy. And so you'll see this in people that do not have their full field of external rotation. They try to internally rotate on top of it, and they don't have enough rotational capability, so they end up picking up their big toe off the ground, and they can still turn, but it becomes an orientation. And if I can recapture the first metatarsal head as I perform my downswing, a lot of good things can still happen. But if I don't do that, then I'm all over the place. I'm going to hit fat, I'm going to hit thin. Who knows what the club face is going to do actually under those circumstances. And so if you're spraying the ball all over the place, I would start looking at your right foot position. If we look at the thorax, we're going to have the same concept that we have in the pelvis. So where I was creating that yielding action in that early propulsive representation, I'm going to have a thorax that looks like basically the same shape. I'm going to create a delay in that right side of the thorax. So I'm going to have an expansive strategy in the right side of the thorax, and that's what's going to allow me to turn. So turning is both sides moving forward at the same time. It's just that one side is moving faster than the other, and that's what produces the turn. So I have the delay on the right, I have overcoming on the left, and that's what produces my turn into my backswing. Now, Johnny, your question about the internal rotation representation. So if I am moving from my expanded inhalation ER strategy, early propulsive representation in the backswing, I need to get to IR. So that's going to turn the sacrum straight ahead. I'm going to IR both ilia, and I'm going to be in this exhaled position. This is my high force producing strategy. So this is my IR representation. So I went from an ER here to an IR in the middle. This is where the pelvic outlet is going to become concentrically oriented. It's going to produce my force upward. It's going to squeeze. I'm going to compress, and this is my high force producing. So I will have a representation of internal rotation at this point. So if we look at the foot The same thing's going to happen in the foot. I'm going to move from my early propulsive representation, which is ER with my arch. I'm going to see the arch come down, and I'm going to start to lower the arch. I'm going to drive this into rotation. So I have a tibia that's moving into rotation. So I'm going to see an element of pronation until I get to the point where I have to produce maximum force. So in a golf swing, it's probably where you're in a right-handed golfer, it's going to be where your left arm is parallel to the ground. That's where you're going to start to produce that highest force, because that's where the club head is going to start to accelerate. That's where you're going to produce that force. It'll be demonstrated, and you will immediately move back into external rotation, and the club head is going to pick up all of its speed there. In the thorax, we're going to see a much more of a symmetrical representation under most circumstances. You'll see idiosyncratic differences in any number of golfers because of physical structure, but basically what we're looking at is we're looking at a compressed dorsal rostral thorax under those circumstances. Again, after that instantaneous moment of maximum force production, I'm going to see the turn into the left, and I'm going to see a reversal of the original strategy that I saw on the backside. So now I'm going to see the delay on the left, I will see the overcoming on the right, and that's what's going to allow me to produce my turn to the left. So under those circumstances, what we're going to need to have then is access to an internal rotation that's superimposed on external rotation going to the left. And so again, I'm going to have the same problem that I had on the backside. If I don't have the ER capabilities in my follow-through position, I'm not going to be able to turn into it and produce my IR. Now, having said that, let's talk about bad things. If I don't have the ER field to turn into to produce my internal rotation, I'm still going to produce internal rotation. So where am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to have to produce it somewhere else. So I can have an anterior orientation of the pelvis. I could tip my pelvis forward. That's going to help me produce my internal rotation. But what if I'm trying to produce more external rotation that I don't have because maybe I don't have that ER field? Where can I get it? Well, remember we talked about disc herniations a while back as well. I might use my disc as my yielding strategy. So I create the expansion through the disc. We call that anything from a disc bulge to a disc herniation to however you want to term it. It's going to be an expansion through the disc. So now I'm a golfer with a disc problem, and I'm going to end up talking to my spinal surgeon potentially because I have been using my disc as a yielding strategy instead of producing it through the pelvis, through the spine, and through the hip as I would want to distribute it. So now we're right back to the beginning of your very first question. If I'm talking about not having the field of ER at the other end in follow through, and I want to superimpose internal rotation on top of that, now I might be looking at a left knee strategy to try to produce that internal rotation. So again, if I don't have the internal rotation production at the hip the way I would want to, I'm going to tip my pelvis down, or I turn that femur in to internal rotation to produce force into the ground, and now I've got ACL stress, I've got anterior knee pain because I've got a patella that's getting pulled laterally. So I could have any number of maladies that are associated with the orientation and alignment that I'm using to produce internal rotation when I do not have external rotation at both ends. So Johnny, the end game here as far as this discussion goes is, yes, I need to have this representation of internal rotation. It's going to be that nutated sacrum. It's going to be an IR at ilium. I'm going to have an internal rotation representation that's high force, high compression, concentric pelvic outlet, internal rotation at the hip, tremendous force into the ground, hopefully. But if I don't have my field of ER first, I'm not going to capture that representation. I'm going to use substitutions, and I'm probably going to pay a little bit of the price for that. So Johnny, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys next week.